Hello, my name is Eric Putkonen. Thank you for joining me. Today I'm talking about the end of sorrow. Now, sorrow includes also sadness and grief. They are kind of all the same flavor, so to speak. But when you look into Buddhist teachings, there's various, teachers and masters over the years that have talked about ending sorrow, overcoming sadness and grief. And the same is also true in Advaita Vedanta. And I think that's partly because sorrow, sadness, and grief are also just other forms of suffering, and suffering ceases after enlightenment. Now, there's a lot of, misunderstanding around this, because some will say, well, this happens because you no longer feel emotion, which isn't true. There's still the capability, the possibility of feeling such emotions. They just don't arise due to the change of understanding, the fundamental viewpoint of the world. And so there's still contentment, peace, joy, happiness, awe, love, bliss. There's other emotions. And yet, sorrow, grief, and sadness do not arise. Well, why? Because all action and reaction, including emotional reaction, arises due to our own current understanding or misunderstanding, as the case may be. And so if the fundamental core understanding changes, our reactions change. And this is very possible. It's not being cold or inhuman. For example, if a loved one passes, that you don't have grief. You don't have sadness and sorrow. It's not being cold. Actually, there still can be quite a deep love for them. There can also be an appreciation of having known them in the first place, a gratitude even. There can be great compassion and feeling of love and kindness. But the sorrow and sadness and grief arises if the beliefs have things like there is a personal loss, that you resist the impermanence of the world. There's these various beliefs we hold on to. And as a form of maybe playing devil's advocate with yourself, we'll use death of loved ones as the one to play with, because whether it has happened yet or hasn't, it can be imagined. But if you think about a loved one and their passing, what is your belief on what happens? Now, in non-duality, they don't go anywhere. No one goes anywhere. But say you're in the Judean-Christian line, or some other faith that they went to heaven, some great grand place. On what basis do you feel sorrow, sadness, or grief? Is it selfish in nature? It's a attachment you had that was broken. You wanted to possess them, keep them forever, which you can't, of course, because everything's impermanent. Everything is changing. We have no control over when or how things change. Another loved one could die today, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year. It could be 10 years from now. Who knows? But it's inevitable. And so reality has shown yet again that everything is impermanent and you have little or no control over it. And having that which you're trying to hold on to ripped away, that attachment, it stings. And there's this selfish, well, I wanted to keep them with me longer. Is that what's driving it? If they're going to this great place, let's say they moved to a utopia, some paradise. They can't move back, they can't leave, and you can't visit. You might be living in the slums, but they're in a paradise. On what basis would you be sad, grief-stricken, or sorrowful? That they are in a so much better place than you. Why couldn't they stay in this hole with me? I know this sounds harsh, but it's playful in nature. And the idea is you need to play as devil advocate what basis you're playing off of here. Because it is your own beliefs, your own concepts, your own assumptions, your fundamental worldview that makes sorrow, grief, and sadness arise. On what basis is it arising? Because if you believe they're in a better place, why are you holding it against them? You know, what is this selfish impulse of, how dare they leave me? See, the thing is you have to believe you lost something for these emotions really to arise. And for those that have realized non-duality, the non-dual nature of things, there's nowhere to go. It's impossible to lose anything. It's impossible to gain anything. So a loved one passing means they haven't gone anywhere. And if you haven't lost anybody and they didn't go anywhere, what changed? Assuming you feel, sorrow, grief, and sadness. You have to look at these assumptions. And for me, when I look back at the over 18 years since awakening, I haven't experienced any of these for that entire time. There's been no sorrow, sadness, or grief. And I credit that with the fundamental change of my core understanding. The way things are understood to be. There's no me, there's no loss, let alone a personal loss. There is, all forms are impermanent and changing. And so it's totally accepted, surrendered to, and unconditionally embraced as if it is now. And so some people will say, well, you can say you haven't felt sorrow, grief, or sadness because life hasn't been hard on you yet. I've had that argument. But over 18 years, I've had to part from friends. I've moved. I've had relatives pass away. I've had grandparents, aunts and uncles, my father-in-law. There's been multiple deaths in my family over 18 years. And there will be more. It's inevitable. But it doesn't result or react in the feeling of sadness, sorrow, and grief, because all action and reaction, including emotional reaction, arises due to our current understanding or misunderstanding, as the case may be. And so that fundamental way we view the world, based on beliefs and concepts and assumptions, potentially, is what causes the reactions to arise as they do. And so over 18 years, there hasn't been that reaction. I'm not faulting that reaction in anybody else. In no way am I saying, thou shalt not fear sorrow, sadness, or grief. I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying you should repress it. I'm not saying anything of the sort. I'm just saying we need to understand that it's arising because of what's in here. The way we think, the way we view the world, that is why it's arising. And it's possible for the end of sorrow to happen, for the cessation of sadness and grief, for it to no longer arise in very similar situations. Now, in no way am I saying this should be a hard and fast rule to prove enlightenment. As some people would like to do. They would go, well, look at Ramana Maharshi. When his mother died, he shed tears. So that's sorrow and sadness and grief, and so that must be proof he's not enlightened. And I'd say, well, that's not true at all. The vasanas, the samskaras, the inner conditioning, the unseen conditioning, until it is seen or triggered, so it's seen, will often remain unseen. And so there might have been some attachment, something in the body mind of Ramana Maharshi that when his mother died, he shed a few tears. But those few tears came and went. It wasn't an all-day wail. It wasn't a grieving period of week or weeks. It was a few tears and they went away. And so I think the nature of that sadness, sorrow, and grief is very different. And so at times I'd like to say that if there's chronic sadness, sorrow, or grief in your life, well, then that's probably proof enlightenment hasn't happened yet. Because even though Ramana Maharshi shed a few tears at his mother's death, he wasn't crying every time somebody died. Even at his own upcoming demise, while others were wailing at his impending death, he would say things like, well, they tell me that I'm dying, but where would I go? I'm here. He's implying he's not going to go anywhere. And so there's a deeper, fundamental core understanding that even if a conditioning comes and goes, it passes quickly. And it doesn't tend to recur over and over again with other similar scenarios. And so I would say if there's chronic sorrow, sadness, and grief, they're probably not enlightened. It hasn't happened yet. Because I don't know of any nobody that I've recognized as enlightened that at the same time chronically has sorrow, sadness, or grief. I mean, this goes back even to the Buddha. The Buddha would talk about, overcoming the sadness, sorrow, and grief, and not giving away your peace in such scenarios. To not let such scenarios affect your own peace. And so, in the stories of the deaths of the loved ones of the Buddha, he wasn't wailing every time either. There is a recurring theme that sorrow, sadness, and grief don't really arise after awakening. And while some people can't even imagine what that would be like, it just comes down to your fundamental core view of the world, how you currently understand it or misunderstand it. And so if you are wanting some escape from sorrow, sadness, or grief, you have to look at what are your fundamental beliefs behind it. Now, If enlightenment happened, great, and that's why a lot of times in non-duality they'll say, well, keep with self-inquiry, keep looking at the self, basically keep doing what you can to create a conducive environment for enlightenment to occur. And if enlightenment occurs, then this stuff will be resolved. But some people really want to get out of some grief they're having, in which case I would say, well, for that one scenario, you might want to tackle the fundamental assumptions, beliefs, concepts, your viewpoint that is making that reaction arise. Because if the understanding changes, the reactions change. They go together. Again, it's not unfeeling. There's still deep care. There's still deep love. It's just not having the attachments and incorrect view. The attachments, which are part of the incorrect view, but the incorrect viewpoint, the fundamental misunderstanding that's causing this to arise. But if you have no problem with sorrow, grief, or sadness, well, then it's not incorrect. I'm just saying it's incorrect from the stance of someone who wants to get out of sorrow. Not as a flaw in some way or a sin because of these beliefs. We don't want to make an issue out of sadness, sorrow, and grief. It's not, the point isn't to demonize or make it a failing if there is sorrow. The point is, it can end, it can cease. And not only is it possible, if it does end and cease, that doesn't mean you're unfeeling, it doesn't mean you're cold, it doesn't mean all this other stuff, because people are very attached to the idea of there should be grief and sorrow. Because I once saw, there was some quote, I can't remember who made the quote, but you see a lot of meme quotes and different things like that, but somebody was saying, had quoted some author, I think it was an author or artist or somebody, they said, grief is the price of love. And I had to correct them, and I said, no. Love doesn't necessarily result in grief. Grief is the price of attachment. And that was not received well by many because they thought, well, no, how could you love somebody and not grieve them? They couldn't even conceive of the way love could be. And like I said, it is different way of viewing things, but it can be that you can love someone deeply and not feel sorrow or be sorry when they go. The going was inevitable. The going is natural. It was going to happen. Everything's impermanent. And that's from a form standpoint. But the truth of the matter is, they didn't go anywhere. There was no going in the first place. And so there is this different understanding that can change the way reactions and actions arise. And so it's something to play with. But like I said, in a playful way. Because you don't want to, like I said, you don't want to make this an issue, a sin, demonize it in some way, feel that you need to repress it or correct it. It's nothing about that. It is fundamentally playing with what is my fundamental beliefs, concepts, and assumptions that were triggered by this happening in the world whether it's happened or not, or yet. Maybe you're imagining a loved one passing as a thought experiment, but you're basically going on what basis is the reaction as it is. And that's something you can look at. But anyways, if you got any questions, comments, please post below. Until next time, thank you much.